Lisbon in 1755 stood as one of Europe's most beautiful and well-established capitals, but within no time, a single morning wiped away the whole capital from the history. The combined effect of the earthquake, the tsunamis and the fires wrote down the dark fate of Lisbon. So I did what I always do. I turned to historic images and AI to help travel back to the old Lisbon. Come with me now as we walk those plazas and alleyways, and then witness one shattering and world-changing morning when this beautiful city simply vanished. It was Saturday morning, the 1st of November 1755, and Lisbon was absolutely alive with people. The city's population had swelled over recent decades to one of Europe's largest, somewhere close to 200,000 souls packed into its steep, sun-drenched hillsides. Praça do Comércio and the winding lanes of Baixa were filled with merchants shouting their wares, carriages rattling over uneven cobblestones, and church steeples catching the first gold of the morning light. In the palaces of the capital, nobles prepared for a day of ceremony and prayer. In simpler homes throughout the city, ordinary families lit their All Saints candles and pulled on their best coats for Mass. What makes this moment so heartbreaking to imagine is just how normal and how beautiful it all was. The blue Tagus River, one of Europe's great waterways, flowed gently past the docks where tall trading ships rode at anchor, their hulls loaded with spices, silks, and the breathtaking wealth of a global empire. Lisbon was at the very peak of its golden age, the proud heart of a kingdom that stretched from Brazil to Goa to Macau. And then the ground moved. Just after 9:40 in the morning, the earth lurched beneath the city's feet. It began as a low, bone-deep rumble rising from somewhere far below. Buildings groaned from their foundations upward. Shutters rattled violently off their hinges. Horses reared and threw their riders. People kneeling in church fell forward from their pews. And then the worst of it arrived. For nearly 6 full minutes, the earth rocked in terrifying rolling waves. Walls cracked open like old parchment. The ground itself ripped apart in gashes up to 5 meters wide right through the city centre. The grand royal Ribeira Palace, the opera house that had only opened 6 months earlier, the great patriarchal cathedral, and hundreds of ordinary homes shuddered and then crumbled into themselves. The paved streets disappeared beneath mountains of dust and debris within moments. Modern seismologists now estimate the earthquake measured somewhere between 8.5 and 9.0 on the Richter scale, making it one of the most powerful ever recorded in European history. The energy it released was so immense that the tremors were felt as far away as Finland, North Africa, and even the Caribbean. Survivors poured into plazas and open squares, believing that reaching open ground away from falling masonry was their only hope. But what came next turned their relief into something far, far worse. Down on the docks, the people who had run toward the riverfront stood watching the Tagus in growing disbelief. The water was behaving in a way none of them had ever seen. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, the river drew back from its banks, revealing dark mudflats and stranded vessels lying sideways in the exposed riverbed. Some people, not yet understanding what they were watching, actually walked out onto the newly revealed ground to collect fish and salvage goods from the stranded ships. Then, roughly 40 minutes after the first tremor, a roaring wall of water appeared on the horizon. The tsunamis struck in 3 successive waves, each one more devastating than the last. The first swept up the Tagus so fast that riders on horseback galloped desperately for higher ground and barely made it. Massive breakers smashed into the shipping wharves, overturning vessels that weighed hundreds of tons as though they were toys, and dragged hundreds of people into the churning, freezing water. The wave heights along the coast of Portugal reached somewhere between 6 and 20 metres, depending on the location, and in the town of Cascais, just west of Lisbon, eyewitnesses reported the water rising to heights that swallowed entire streets whole. The sea was not finished. 2 more enormous waves followed, each one tearing through whatever the first had left standing. Entire districts along the Tagus simply ceased to exist. The Ribeira waterfront, one of the most commercially important stretches of coastline in the Portuguese Empire, was gone. By the time the water finally began to recede, the landscape of Lisbon's shoreline had been permanently, irreversibly redrawn. And yet the horror was still not over, because all through the city, flames were taking hold. The earthquake had knocked over candles and oil lamps everywhere, in homes, shops and churches packed with worshippers observing All Saints' Day. Those candles, lit in devotion just hours before, now ignited curtains, wooden furniture, ceilings, timbers, and anything else they touched. Uncontrolled and unchecked, the fires spread rapidly through Lisbon's tightly packed medieval streets, many of which were too narrow for any firefighting effort to gain a foothold. By late morning, smoke columns were rising from the ruins of the royal palace, from convents and monasteries, and from the cathedral itself. The wind carried embers across the city's rooftops, lighting new fires faster than survivors could track them. Those who had escaped the tsunami now found themselves trapped in a nightmarish vice between advancing walls of flame and the water-ruined districts behind them. For 4 full days and nights the firestorm raged, fed by fallen timbers, furniture, textile warehouses, and the oil and spirit stores along the docks. The air across the entire Tagus Valley turned heavy with ash, cinders, and the suffocating smell of burning stone. Of Lisbon's 40 parish churches, 16 collapsed outright or burned completely to the ground. 19 more were left in varying states of ruin, and the handful that still stood had lost most of their walls. The Great Royal Library, one of the finest in Europe, containing some 70,000 meticulously collected books and manuscripts, was destroyed in what must have taken no more than an hour or two. Gone with it were irreplaceable historical records, maps of Portugal's global trade routes, and documents stretching back centuries. By dawn on the 2nd of November, the tremors had quieted, but Lisbon, as it had existed for centuries, was simply no more. Where a magnificent gold-funded capital city had stood just 24 hours before, there was now an unbroken panorama of smoking rubble and ash. Estimates of the death toll in Lisbon alone range from 30,000 to 40,000 people, roughly 1 in 5 of the city's entire population. Across Portugal's southern provinces and reaching as far as Morocco, where the tsunamis also struck devastating blows, the total death count climbed into the tens of thousands more. Back in Lisbon, survivors wandered through the ash in a state of collective shock that contemporaries described again and again in letters and journals as something beyond grief. 2/3 of the city was now completely uninhabitable. Noble palaces that had glittered with gold, tapestries, and the accumulated treasures of a global empire lay levelled and blackened. The grand Teatro da Ópera de Tejo, that extraordinary opera house that had only opened to public celebration on the 31st of March that same year, was a smouldering ruin. The smell of death and smoke hung over everything. Continued aftershocks, some of them significant in their own right, kept the surviving population in a state of sustained terror for weeks and months to come. When the scale of the catastrophe finally became clear, the response from Portugal's leadership was swift and, in historical terms, genuinely remarkable. King José I, deeply traumatized by the disaster, and reportedly so afraid of enclosed spaces afterward that he spent the remainder of his reign living in tented pavilions, delegated the enormous task of reconstruction to his formidably capable Prime Minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known to history as the Marques de Pombal. Pombal's response became legendary. He is said to have answered questions about what to do in the disaster's immediate aftermath with a now famous directness: bury the dead and feed the living. But Pombal went far further than crisis management. Rather than simply rebuilding what had been destroyed, he seized the disaster as an opportunity to reimagine the city entirely. The chaotic medieval street pattern of Baixa was replaced with a rational, earthquake-resistant grid of broad, airy streets and wide public squares. Pombal commissioned engineers and architects to develop a new construction method using flexible wooden cages called gaiolas pombalinas, built inside the stone walls of new buildings, designed specifically to flex rather than crumble during future earthquakes. Lisbon became, in this way, one of the earliest cities in the world to be deliberately rebuilt with seismic resilience in mind. Within a few years, artisans were retiling roofs, blacksmiths were forging iron lintels, and masons were raising new walls on the old foundations. By the century's end, much of the rebuilt city stood in the elegant, restrained style that bears Pombal's name to this day. Large parts of Lisbon that visitors walk through and admire right now are in fact the direct result of that tragedy and that remarkable determined rebuilding effort. Standing here at the edge of 1755 with everything we know, it is genuinely difficult not to feel humbled by the scale of what happened and the scale of what followed. Thank you for walking those streets with me. If this story moved you, please let me know what city or moment in history you would like to explore next. History holds so many buried secrets, and when we stop to really listen, we can still hear their echoes all around us. Please subscribe to the channel and also leave a like. Thank you and see you next time.